is trying to wrap up the letter to the Philippians. So in your Bibles, turn to the letter to the Philippians. The Philippians lived in a place called Philippi. That's why they were called Philippians. In chapter 3, the message was that the followers of Yeshua had to be those who strove to be like him, to model him in their lives. Essentially, those who followed him were called to respect him, respect what he did, and reject those who fought against it. It was a big issue back in those days. There was a lot of conflict between those of the faith and those not of the faith. Remember, they lived in the Roman world, the Roman pagan world. So it was a major issue. They needed to learn to remember and embrace the fact that Yeshua came to lay down his life for those who he served. The whole purpose of this letter is to teach sacrificial living, to teach humility, and to bring about unity in the community. So Philippians 4 is the final chapter of this, in which Paul addresses the underlying purpose, the issue of division among some of the leaders in this community. Throughout the letter, Paul stresses that disunity is grounded in lack of humility. Let me say that again. In a congregation, when there's disunity, it's often based on the fact that there's a lack of humility. Here, Paul calls these leaders to return to unity grounded in the model of Yeshua's humility. It's always devastating to a congregation when its leaders are in conflict. It's like when children experience the divorce of their parents. It's very destabilizing. Paul knew this and did not want this to happen to his friends in Philippi. In the first verse of Philippians 4, he says, "So my brothers," and I would include sisters, "whom I love and long for, my joy and my crown, my dear friends, keep standing firm in union or in unity with the Lord." It's like when there's an athletic contest. The victor in a race usually receives some sort of a prize. In those days, it might have been an olive branch or an olive wreath or crown. Paul considers his relationship to the Philippians his crown. He's not interested in having a gold crown on his head. The people in Philippi were his crown. He expresses it that way. He very much loved these people, and they were a blessing to him in his days, in his final days. So Paul shares that the Philippians are a great joy to him. And despite his suffering, which was much, and impending execution, which was soon, he can rejoice that their faith in Yeshua and their growing more and more to be like the Messiah is a spiritual reward, in other words, a crown on his head. Their faithfulness to God made Paul feel like he had a successful ministry. His prize was that his people, like a parent taking pride in the success of his or her children, Paul took pleasure in their successful spiritual lives of most of his friends in Philippi. There's a Yiddish word, some of you may know a word or two of Yiddish, it's nachas. Nachas means pleasure. You get nachas from your children when they get A's in school, right? You get nachas and pleasure from your children. Paul looked at these Philippians like his children. He got a lot of nachas. It's spelled a little bit like nachos, but not with the O at the end. He was getting pleasure from these kids, these Philippians. But there was also a problem in Philippi. The problem was there was disunity in the community. There was disunity in the community. It grieved him. So he said, and forgive my pronunciation of these Greek names. I got 3 Greek names to try to pronounce this morning, and they're not easy. So in verse 2 he says, I beg Evodia and I beg Syntyche to agree with each other in union with the Lord. That's where he's headed in this letter. As Paul concludes, he mentions the possible primary reason for the letter in the first place was to confront the disunity in this community because of the disagreement between these two women, dare I say it. Remember, at the beginning of this, I shared with you that there were no synagogues in Philippi because there were not that many Jews. So when Paul went to Philippi, he found a group of people, women basically, down by the river, and he shared with them, and that's where they had Bible study, or if you would, that's where they had fellowship. Mostly women in this community. Paul knew the conflicts among the leaders would be detrimental and devastating to the community, and therefore he took the opportunity in this letter to confront the division between these two prominent women in Philippi. It's hard to believe that two women could divide this congregation, but I guess it does happen. I think women, I'm at risk here, I think, but I'll just say it. I think he was concerned about how devastating this conflict was in this community between the two leaders in the community who happened to be women. So he decided to confront it right then and there. He uses a Greek word that means I beg you, I urge you, I exhort you, I appeal to you. This very strong Greek word to show how important this issue was to him. He knew the negative effect on the entire congregation if these two women could not get along. It was a strong word indicating his grave concern. As a rabbi, I can tell you, I always grieve when people are having problems in our community. It happens. Thankfully, it hardly happens. But when it does, it's very painful. I preach unity in our community. We have a lot of different opinions here. We come from different places and we have different ideas. Doesn't matter. God calls us to have unity in our community. That's what Paul is saying to the Philippians. Throughout the letter, he's been dealing with the importance of humility, with positive examples of himself in chapter 1, the ultimate example of humility, Yeshua the Messiah in chapter 2, Timothy and Epaphroditus in chapter 2 also, and then in chapter 3, contrasting negative examples there. Given Paul's emphasis earlier in this letter on humility leading to unity, sheds light on Paul's issue of pride and lack of humility in the relationship between Evodia and Syntyche. It not only affected their relationship, which sure made them miserable, but it threatened to destroy this community of God. So Paul used this Greek word phroneo, which means referring specifically to the attitude of people toward one another. He used it in imploring these two women for the sake of unity in the community to get along, to figure out how to get over their issues. Paul is reminding these women of what their mindset should be. What should their mindset be? The same mindset the Messiah had. They were far from it. Calling them to put aside their wrong attitude in order to model Yeshua, who is their ultimate example. I would say that's true for us too, whether we're men or women. If we could all be like Yeshua, we would probably have 100% unity in our community all the time. I know that's not going to happen, but we need to do our best to model Yeshua's life in our community. As Paul modeled the Messiah, he expected those in leadership to do the same. One of the characteristics of a good congregational leader is not to be argumentative, demonstrating that they can get along with the people. Leaders of congregations need to promote harmony and unity. In Paul's first letter to Timothy, that's the letter in the Bible called 1 Timothy. Why is it called 1 Timothy? Somebody say, well, it was his first letter. Let's call it 1 Timothy, right? The books of the Bible did not come from heaven. You understand that? The titles, they're made up by people who put the Bible together. So in the first letter that Rav Shaul, Paul wrote to Timothy, which we call 1 Timothy, he says these words: a congregation leader must be above reproach. He must be faithful to his wife, temperate, self-controlled, orderly, hospitable, and able to teach. He must not drink excessively or get into fights. Rather, he must be kind and gentle. 1 Timothy 3, verses 2 and 3. There are other characteristics, but these particular ones pertained to the issue that was going on in Philippi. Can you imagine leaders of a congregation getting into fights? Maybe they meant fist fights. If you ever watch the parliament in Israel, in England, when they have parliamentary debates, you would think they're going to have a fist fight any second now. If you want to watch something fascinating, you think our Congress debates and arguments, well, you should see the people in England in the parliament. Check it out sometime. You would think these nice English people who are supposed to be so civilized had eaten the wrong food for breakfast, because they are ready to fight, and you can see almost that they're going to come to fist fight as well. So he says, I request you, and this is another name I cannot pronounce, Syzygus, to help these women. This is verse 3. For they have worked hard proclaiming the good news with me, along with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers, whose names are in the book of life. So he's asking this person to help these two women get themselves at peace with one another. And he said, these people are written in the book of life, the Lamb's book of life. And that's an encouragement. So here he appeals to them, this person, to help resolve the issue. Paul referred to Evodia and Syntyche as his fellow workers, a reference to their close working relationship with Paul in his ministry. Like Paul, they would have faced persecution for their commitment to the work of spreading the good news of the Messiah. You know, there's nothing that draws people closer together than suffering together. Anyone who's been in military service knows how special army buddies can be. Anybody been in the army or the military? I think you would agree with me that if you go through suffering together, whether it's in boot camp or actually battle, there's a closest that comes, because suffering unites people. It can also divide people. But if people can work through their suffering, it's a very unifying experience. Nothing draws people together like that. So Paul was very close to these two women because they had suffered together. As leaders in the community, their lack of unity affected the whole community. Throughout his letter, Paul calls the Philippians to unity through modeling the humility of Yeshua. And he closes this letter, he calls for unity and humility to begin among the leaders of that particular community. Now, in addressing the conflict between these two women leaders, Paul stresses the importance of accountability for all those that were in the Philippian Messianic community, from the leaders to everyone else. Paul's emphasis on the importance of leaders serving as examples of Messiah is a theme throughout the letter. Just as Paul uses himself, Timothy, Epaphroditus, and Clement as examples, he also wants these two women to resolve their disunity so they can be an example of the Messiah to other people that they had influence over. It's very important. He understood that their testimony would go out in the community, not their Messianic community, but the non-believing community. And the testimony needed to be something attractive to the Romans. So he begged them to come to peace, because the Romans had plenty of problems with all their organizations. He's trying to say something is different about Messianic people. Would you agree with that? In theory, right, that Messianic people have a different calling on our lives. We've received the Holy Spirit when we were born again. We should be living godly lives. And when we're not, the community around here in Clarksville, Columbia, whatever it is, Central Maryland, looks at us and they go, they're no different than anybody else. We need to show that we're believers and followers of Messiah by our behavior, by our love for one another. We need unity in our community. So Paul places great importance on this, becoming Messiah-like in everything they do. Now the Philippians were a small Roman city, okay, in Macedonia. Do we have a map? Do I have my pointer? I don't want to turn around. The map up there. It's hard to get off of this seat. I don't want to fall. But here we go. Here's Macedonia, and here's Philippi. Over here is where Paul's been dealing with the Galatians. Israel's down over here somewhere. And so he's been traveling, and he's here in Macedonia, and, oh, that's good, which is in this area here. And right now, there are those who think he's in Italy, in Rome, which I think he is. And his goal is ultimately to go to Spain. His goal was to reach this entire world, the known world at that time of the Mediterranean Sea. The Roman government was very powerful, and they could be very cruel, and you had to behave. So in a way, what was going on here, because the Philippians highly valued their Roman citizenship as a Roman colony, Paul declares that through their faith in Yeshua, they have even greater citizenship as one written in the book of life, the citizen of heaven. We can see this in many examples in the Bible, that God calls us to recognize that we may be living in Maryland or DC or wherever you live, but we really are living ultimately in the heavenlies. That's our ultimate home. This is temporary. So he goes on to say that they need to be living in union with the Messiah. Rejoice in union with the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. You know that expression, right? He's calling them to be celebratory, to have joy in their lives. Here Paul calls the Philippians in this very famous verse, not as a temporary feeling or emotion, but as a joy that has staying power based on their faith commitment in Yeshua. This joy is not an emotion, but an authentic experience of God's faithfulness and His continued promise of guidance, provision, protection, and direction. The cause for the Philippians to be able to rejoice is what? The good news. Guess what? If we're called to rejoice, we have the good news. Good news, not bad news. The gospel means good news. We have all been infused with good news. That means we can rejoice. Think about that. We've been given the gift of the ability to have joy in our lives because we've been given the good news and we received it. So that was the cause for the Philippians to have this joy. So it enables Paul to say to them, let everyone see how reasonable and gentle you are. The Lord is near. Interesting little comment. There's an awareness that there comes a day when each of us has to give an account of every word we say and every action we take. Are you aware of that? It's like God has this enormous video camera in heaven. There's been a lot of people on this earth, and He has a record of all this. And one of these days, we're going to have to sit down with Him and have a chat. I'm not sure I'm looking forward to that. How about you? Think about it for a second. Supposing after services, we walk out here in the lobby and Yeshua taps us on the shoulder and says, Michael, I have a video of you. I want to have a little chat with you. Michael's a great guy, but maybe he's not perfect. I don't know. Is he perfect? Look, is he perfect? No need to comment. No need to comment. But the fact is, none of us are perfect, and we all could use a little chat from the Lord above. If we knew that was going to happen today, don't you think it would change our behavior? Well, one day it's going to happen. It's going to happen. We will be evaluated. And I'm not sure how that's going to feel. We can always say, well, Yeshua saved me and He atoned for my sin. That's correct. But there is a judgment for believers as well. Don't forget that. We have to give an account of every word we say and every action we do. And Paul urges his friends, most probably focusing on these two women, to consider that fact. Don't worry about anything. On the contrary, verse 6, make your requests known to God by prayer and petition with thanksgiving. This memorable verse from Paul, verse 6, is teaching the Philippians about the importance of prayer as a source of breaking away from worry. The greatest counter to worrying is to place all our concerns on God in prayer. David Stern makes an interesting point in his commentary that those who do not want to bring issues to God in prayer are showing something that is kind of unseemly. If you don't feel that you never need to pray, that means you have a problem with pride. If you think you can do it all yourself, it means that you have a problem with pride. I say that myself, speaking to myself as well. The fact is, we should strive to do everything we can in our own strength, because God gives us brains and bodies to do this. But ultimately, we have to lean on Him, because we're going to come against things that are too difficult to do. Happens to me all the time. I have a problem finding things. If I could look at a cabinet, a cupboard, and I can't find things. They might be right on the shelf. So Lisa, can you help me find the bottle of such and such? And she says, it's right there on the shelf. I said, oh, I didn't see it. But somehow I see it then. Now I know it's weird, but I think when I was born, I didn't have the finding gene. And so it's hard for me to find things. And thankfully, she's around most of the time. She's in Michigan with her mother this week, trying to help her mother get settled. She's getting up there in years and needs to be some decisions made. But I believe that I'm supposed to try to find the bottle myself, but sometimes I cannot see it. And that's when I call Lisa. She's not God. But likewise, we can call upon God when we're beyond ourselves. Let's remember that. Paul is trying to get these two women to realize that they may have no idea how to solve their conflict, but God does. So the first resort then is go to prayer. After we can't do it ourselves, we should be involved in praying. It's a good practice to do at all times if we're able to do it. Then he calls the people to stand firm in their faith. Verse 7, then God's shalom, passing all understanding, will keep your hearts and minds safe in union with the Messiah Yeshua. In conclusion, brothers, focus your thoughts on what is true, noble, righteous, pure, lovable, or admirable, on some virtue or on something praiseworthy. This is his advice. His closing words to the Philippian believers is to focus their thoughts on good stuff, not bad stuff. How many of us have had the experience in recent years, maybe recent months, maybe last week, when we're watching the news saying, I can't deal with this anymore? My mother, God bless her, doesn't watch the news anymore. She said it makes her so upset because you got people on the left hating the people on the right hating the people on the left. You got Muslims talking about filing submitting a law to Congress to support BDS, which means boycott, divestiture, and sanction of Israel. You got such tension in the world today. Have you noticed? I mean, sometimes it's overwhelming, and my poor mother doesn't want to even watch the news anymore. She's 96. She can't handle it. And I experience that myself sometimes. Maybe you do too. Sometimes it just gets overwhelming. The conflicts in the world are overwhelming. You know, we're fine in the Middle East, and then Iran decides to capture 2 British boats. You know, we don't know what's going to happen. It's a very scary place that we live in. But what Paul is telling his followers is to think on the good stuff. Think on what is positive. Stop thinking about the negative, think about the positive. It'll change our lives. We will live longer if we have positive lives. I remember the time I was invited to speak in a church in Colorado, up in the mountains. Sort of a nice opportunity. I don't ski, and it was, I believe it was January or February. There was snow everywhere. I don't ski. I did actually do a little bit of cross-country skiing just because I had never done that before, which is an exhausting thing to do, by the way. But I noticed in this church there was a certain peace they had. You know, I come from the East Coast, the New York, Philadelphia, Washington corridor, which is really nothing but stress. Let's face it. These people were peaceful. I said, what is it about you that keeps you peaceful like that? Don't you know what's happening in the world today? They said, no. I said, what do you mean you don't know what's happening in the world today? They say, well, we can't do anything about it, so we just deal with stuff in our lives. In other words, they realized that deciding on what's going to happen between China and the United States and Russia and the United States or Israel and Iran, it's not in our ability to do anything about it. So they chose as a congregation to not even deal with it. They don't know what's happening. It's not going to make a bit of difference in their lives. If an A-bomb hits Denver, they're going to be wiped out. But they're not going to worry about it in the meantime. I thought that was an interesting way to live. It's like what they say, what's it called, the alcoholic's prayer. God, give me the power to change the things I can change, accept the things I can't change, and know the difference between the two. It's a sane way to live. I think Paul's sort of doing that. So he says, in conclusion, brothers, focus your thoughts on what is true, noble, righteous, pure, lovable, or admirable, or some virtue or something praiseworthy. Choose what you focus on, he's saying. It's a very important message for us today. We have to choose what we focus on, and we want to focus on good things, not bad things. So keep doing what you have learned, he says, and receive from me what you have heard and seen me doing. Then the God who gives you shalom will be with you. He's encouraging them to follow his ways, because his ways were very godly ways. He had set himself to follow the Messiah. Now he's saying to them, follow me as I follow the Messiah. We need to practice being in the world, but not of the world. You ever heard that expression? That's where we have to be today, my friends. We have to practice being in the world, but not of the world. We live here, but we don't have to be involved with all the world's problems. And he closes in verses 10 through 18. He says, by sharing love and thankfulness for the Philippians. Let me just read this to you. In union with the Lord, I rejoice that now, after this long time, you have let your concern for me express itself again. Of course, you were concerned for me all along, but you had no opportunity to express it. Not that I'm saying that's to call attention to any need of mine, since as far as I am concerned, I have learned how to be content regardless of all my circumstances. I know what it is to want, meaning to not have anything, and I know what it is to have more than enough. In everything and in every way, I have learned the secret of being full and the secret of being hungry, of having abundance and being in need. He's telling his friends, oh yeah, I know now you can give to support what I'm doing, but I don't need it one way or another. I've learned how to live with nothing, and I've learned how to live with everything. I've learned to abase and to abound. This is a very mentally healthy way to live. So these verses show the mutual love that Paul shared with the Philippians. He gave them his all to bring the message of the Messiah, and he cared for them as their shepherd for many years. And they are now showing their love by financial giving and sending Epaphroditus to be their emissary to Paul. It's a powerful lesson. As he wrote elsewhere, he's learned how to abase and to abound. You know, sometimes it's just as difficult to be rich as it is to be poor. Now, that sounds like that doesn't make any sense. But when you think about it, poor people, if they don't have the right attitude, can get resentful toward God and end up hating God. Rich people can get to the place where they don't think they need God anymore. and they can actually walk away from the faith. Very often, we know stories of people who have been poor, they were very spiritual, and then they made it, became wealthy, and they forgot all about from whence they came. Bad idea. So he's saying that this should not be. But he says, I can do all things through him who gives me the power. This is a famous verse. From his experience, he encourages the Yeshua followers to continue to pray, because they can do all things through the Messiah who gives them strength. Yeah, just as Yeshua promised the Holy Spirit to those who observed his commands and walked in his example, Paul can confidently comment to the Philippians the assurance of Holy Spirit-empowered lives if they trust in Yeshua. Verse 14, nevertheless, it was good for you to share my trouble. He's saying, I didn't really need your money, but I'm glad you shared my situation. He's talking about this love relationship he has with the Philippians. He says, you Philippians yourselves know that in the early days of my work spreading the good news, when I left Macedonia, not a single congregation shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, only you. Remember, he served a lot of congregations in Asia Minor. This was the only one, and it wasn't in Asia Minor, it was Macedonia, the only one that supported his ministry. Those of us in ministry, particularly missionaries, which I was many decades ago, need the support of brothers and sisters who believe in what we're doing. All the mission organizations, whether it's Campus Crusade for Christ, Jews for Jesus, Chosen People Ministry, Friends of Israel, rely on the love and support financially of believers. It's a part of the way this works. But he recognized now that this congregation in Philippi was the only one that was sending him financial support. But he didn't want to be beholden to them. So he didn't want to have them support him totally. He wanted to be free. There's something good about that clergy are not employees of their congregations. Let me say that again. Clergy, it's good that clergy, rabbis, pastors, are not employees of their congregations. I am not an employee of this congregation. I'm dedicated to this congregation as I've been for well over 30 years. I've never been an employee of the congregation. Why is that? Well, first of all, the IRS allows that. But the good thing about it is I can teach what I want. If I was an employee and there was a board of directors to the congregation who said, you know, we're not so pro-Israel anymore. We buy into the BDS Mishigas. I say, well, that's not what I'm teaching. They say, well, then you're fired. It's good not to be an employee of a congregation because you can be free to teach what God puts on your heart to teach. I think that's kind of what he's saying here. He didn't want to be dependent on any of the congregations, and you know what he did for a living? He made tents or something like that.